It's Friday, the 5th of May, 2023.
The last word in podcasting news. This is the Podnews Weekly Review with James Cridland and Sam Sethi.
I'm James Cridland, the editor of Podnews.
And I'm Sam Sethi, the CEO of Podfans.
In the chapters today, Spotify Podcasts is still growing, and now it offers monetization options outside of the US. A review of the latest data and numbers for April is host-read advertising being undervalued. The Podcast Academy tells us who does what, and the winners of the ARIAs and the Publisher Podcast Awards were announced. And
hi, I'm Quamme Rhoden. I'm principal engineer at Acast, and I'll be on later to talk about Acast's support of the Podcast Standards Project.
This is Nick Hilton. I'm the director of photo and podcast blogger, and I'll be on later to talk about the value of podcast host-read advertising.
They will. This podcast is sponsored and hosted by Buzzsprout. Last week, 3,889 people started a podcast with Buzzsprout. Podcast hosting made easy with powerful tools and remarkable customer support. And now you can turn your listeners into supporters with Buzzsprout subscriptions. And we're sponsored by Podnews Live, where podcasting connects in Manchester in June. Get your tickets at podnews.net/live.
Podnews Live, where the podcast industry connects. Get your tickets now at podnews.net/live. From your daily newsletter, the Podnews Weekly Review.
James, so let's kick this off. Here's a little fun fact for you. April, there was one new podcast episode every 1.5 seconds. That's quite mad, really, isn't it?
I know, it's a ridiculous number, isn't it? Yes, 1.7 million podcasts published in April, which makes it one every 1.5 seconds. It's quite a thing.
Now, talking of quite a thing, we've written the obituary on this product several times, but it seems to keep coming back. Spotify for Podcasts has posted its second highest share of new episodes, growing 13% in January. So Spotify's megaphone has also continued to grow as well. But Spotify for Podcasts, I thought genuinely that was it. It was going to be buried, put away, never to be talked about again. But somehow it seems to be growing. Tell me more, why?
Yes, it's amazing what a brand does. So they changed it away from being called Anchor in March. And certainly March and April have seen significant growth for the product, which is now called Spotify for Podcasters, their hosting product. That is doing really, really well. And I think, perhaps it's just that people see the Spotify brand and they go, "Oh, we trust the Spotify brand," and maybe we didn't really trust the Anchor brand. And so maybe that's one of the reasons why we're seeing more and more people using Spotify for Podcasters to host their show. That said, Spotify's Megaphone has actually published their best ever figures in terms of share of new episodes as well, according to livewire.io. So clearly Spotify's hosting companies are having a moment.
Well, there you go. They've also started rolling out some monetization products, automated ads and ambassador ads to more countries.
Yeah, well, so this used to be only the US, and you used to be able to sign up for ambassador ads, which was normally a host read for Anchor. Not very many other things ended up going in there. And also then automated ads, which they launched not so long ago, which was essentially advertising from big brands automated into your individual show. But that's always been a US-only thing until now, because as part of a closed beta, the company's reaching out to selected podcasters in the UK and Australia. It's invite only. But you do get invited to take part, and they're planning to test more markets later on in the year. And I have to say, I think this is hitherto such a missed opportunity for Spotify. They do so well in many parts of the world, particularly Europe, mainland Europe, a lot of Asia, a lot of Latin America as well. They do incredibly well. Real opportunities for them there. And it's been strange to see them only focusing on the US. And I kind of understand why that is, but I think that there's real opportunity for them. So, I think great news for the larger Spotify company there.
Well, moving on from Spotify, looking at some of the other companies out there, SiriusXM released their Q1 financials. We talked about Spotify's last week. In Sirius, the podcast revenue is up 34%. That's pretty amazing. Although their overall revenue declined by 2%. And Cumulus Media also released their Q1 financials, and they saw an increase in podcast ads up by 23%, although their revenue in total slumped by 12%. So again, are these companies doing well? I can't quite work out. Stuff's going up, but actually overall it's going down.
Well, I mean, the way that I look at this from a Podnews lens is to look at just the podcast revenue. SiriusXM makes most of its money flogging radios to car manufacturers. Cumulus Media makes most of its money flogging radio ads to people who are getting older and more irrelevant to ad buyers. So from that point of view, are they doing well? No, not really. But are they doing well in terms of podcast revenue? Yes, absolutely. I mean, tremendous growth for both SiriusXM's podcast business, which of course includes Stitcher and Simplecast and various others, doing really well there, and Cumulus Media doing really well too, and indeed iHeartMedia, which again, they're actually seeing some tremendous figures for podcast revenue, $77 million, up 12% year on year, and that's now 9.4% of the company's total. So again, iHeartMedia obviously doing radio advertising and other things, but again, podcast revenue doing fantastically well. So great news for podcasting, even if the rest of those companies aren't necessarily doing quite so great. And I think that's always worthwhile having a focus on.
Now let's have a look at some of the data from April. April's average CPM rates, according to Libsyn's AdvertiseCast, were up 4% to a whopping $23.07. The company also announced that it's sponsoring the 2023 IAB podcast Upfront. And I went, what's Upfront, James? So I'm going to ask you, what's Upfront?
What is Upfront? The IAB podcast Upfront, which I think is next week or the week after, but it's basically lots of podcast networks spending an awful lot of money to get into one room and to talk to the ad buyers and to basically say, here are some of our shows coming up. You should be advertising in them. I went to a podcast Upfront a couple of years ago in LA, and it was, it was really good. Conan O'Brien turned up. That was good. And I think what I found most fascinating is how good and polished some of the podcast publishers are, and how utterly useless some of them were as well, in terms of standing there and getting advertisers interested and excited about some of the new shows that they have coming up. But that's coming up. I keep on getting invited to parties and things in New York that are going alongside the IAB podcast Upfronts, and there's also TV Upfronts and various other things that week as well. And I keep on patiently replying, I'm based in Brisbane in Australia, so it's quite a long way to come for some crappy beer, yes. So that's what the podcast Upfronts are all about. Very, very American thing. Doesn't seem to happen too much in other countries. And in fact, when you start having a look into other countries, like Australia here, then many of the larger publishers will run their own party rather than spending money with the IAB to promote their stuff. So perhaps that kind of makes sense, I think.
Sounds like the draft pick for NFL. Anyway.
Yeah.
Moving on, keeping the good news going, we've talked about revenues up, we've talked about advertising up. The podcast ad spend grew by 32% last year in the UK, according to the IAB. That seems like a massive growth.
Yeah, it does seem like a massive growth. So this is UK numbers, not American numbers, but a growth of 32%. Last year is fantastic. It's up to £76.3 million, which in freedom dollars is $96 million US. So it's a small number, but nevertheless it's a good number and a good growth according to the IAB in the UK. Now there are numbers expected out this month from the IAB in the US, so they should be telling us how podcast advertising worked in the US.
Talking about the US, the time spent listening to podcasting has hit another record high. The share of ear study by Edison Research suggests that podcasts now account for 9% of all time Americans spend with audio. Again, a 31% increase in all time spent with spoken word audio. Seems like everything's on the move upwards, James.
Yeah, it does. It seems like the podcast industry is full of very good news if you ignore all of the people getting made redundant. But if you ignore all of that, then the podcast industry itself is doing pretty well. Numbers are up, revenue is up, and even if you have a look inside the larger companies, then revenue is up there as well. So all of that is all pretty good news, I think.
Yeah, and again, keeping the positivity going, Apple Podcasts increased its share of all downloads to 37.8% in April. Now, I don't get this. Is it just because one's measuring in apples and one's measuring in oranges? Because Spotify is not downloads. Well, they technically are still downloads, but they're not measured against downloads because they're not number one. So they measure in streams and Apple measures in downloads. Is that so they don't have to cross-measure each other?
Well, I mean, Spotify, I'm sure that if Spotify was number one in downloads, they would certainly mention that too. But the reality is that they aren't. Spotify is number one in terms of total audience, in terms of total reach, but the average Spotify listener listens to a couple of podcasts a month. The average Apple Podcasts listener listens to, depending on the figures that you see, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there's a significantly higher number of downloads that happen through Apple Podcasts. And of course, it's worthwhile pointing out that Apple Podcasts also has an element of automated downloads as well, which will obviously have an effect there. But yeah, Spotify's share of downloads has dropped ever so slightly. With Buzzsprout's stats to 28.7% of all shows, Apple Podcasts up slightly to 37.8%. So some good numbers there. Google Podcasts, God rest its soul, is the third most popular podcast app for Buzzsprout users. Once more, 2.5% is their number. So yes, number three, but tiny, 2.5%, 3.4 million downloads. And of course, we have no visibility into YouTube because YouTube hosts everything itself. But some nice numbers that come out of the Buzzsprout platform. I would love Libsyn and Blueberry and other companies to produce these as well. I really wish they would. But if you'd like to see the Buzzsprout numbers, then they're at buzzsprout.com/global_stats. Global_stats, and well worth a peek. The other thing that they do mention is episode download numbers. If you do more than 1,000 downloads in your first 7 days, then you are better than 95% of all podcasts out there, which is quite a thing. So, that's always worth keeping an eye on too.
Yeah. Now, one question in my head. Since the iOS 16.4 update, have we started to see any effect from the Apple Core Media change?
This is one of those effects. The fact that Apple Podcasts has increased from 37.3% to 37.8% of total downloads. I would suspect that will continue going up and should show us a quite decent month, although maybe some might argue that that growth should have been a little bit higher.
Now, looking at the last bit of data that came out, Podsights has released its Q2 podcast advertising benchmark report. The average conversion rate in 2022 was 1.21%, a 9% year-on-year increase. So conversion rates for mobile app installs rose sharply as well by 44%, says the data. Again, some good numbers here again, James.
Yeah, I think so. And, I think Podsights' podcast advertising benchmark report, to be honest, I find quite a lot of it quite difficult to read and understand. But the fact that it is there and the fact that it gives you all of these conversion rates and everything else is very helpful. And it's very nice seeing those numbers going up. So basically what that essentially means is that your advertising is now working 10% more efficiently for no additional money. So that's probably a good thing. And I think it goes to show that the numbers are good because all of the large American broadcasters also weirdly released a ton of data as well. Odyssey shared a state of audio guide. It had a number of case studies in there basically saying that the audio does better than social media. And it says how efficient podcast host reads are and blah, blah, blah. Cumulus Media also shared 7 new findings about the podcast audience. And iHeartRadio cobbled together a very rushed-looking set of 9 or 10 slides called State of Podcasting 2023 with data from Edison Research, very well known and very highly respected market research company. Scarborough, again, a very well known and highly respected market research company, and eMarketer. So slightly weird seeing that, but still, there you go. So I'm not quite sure why all of the US broadcasters were releasing all of these reports on exactly the same day. My suspicion is that both iHeart and Cumulus thought that it would be a nice way of essentially dialing down the good data that Odyssey have just released, but who knows? But again, positive stuff all over the place, which is nice.
Now, you mentioned host-read advertising. Now, friend of the show, Nick Hilton, wrote a post, "Let's change the standard for host-read advertising." And also in the Podcast Business Journal, you had an interview with Dan Granger about a very similar topic, really. The general theme from both of them was that host-read advertising is actually more valuable than it's being portrayed right now, or being valued by it right now. I think Nick Hilton talked about Scott Galloway from Pivot, that if you wanted to get Scott Galloway to read a host-read ad, say for this show, and you go to his agent, he would charge you a fortune. But because Vox Media have him signed to that podcast, he actually does host-read ads at a much cheaper, lower rate, maybe, and the last part, I think, of what he's saying, and I'd love to see what your thoughts were, is that over the long term, if you say the same ads all the time, you become associated to that ad, a bit like George Clooney and Nehru Coffee, for example. Yeah. And is that something that they want to be associated to forever and a day? So, what are your thoughts, James?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as Dan Granger was saying, it's a really important benefit that podcasting has, is that associating hosts with the advertising with the advertising inside the podcast. I mean, we talk a lot about Buzzsprout. Many people associate us with Buzzsprout because we talk about it so much, because they're our sponsor. And I think that there's great value in all of that. And certainly Dan Granger from Oxford Road was saying much the same sort of thing. He was talking about programmatic advertising being a short-sighted compromise because it doesn't allow you to do that. It doesn't allow your hosts to get closer to the advertising as well. It's a great interview which you can read at podcastbusinessjournal.com, which is well worth a read. It'd be interesting to learn a little bit more from Nick about his blog post about host-read advertising.
Well, lucky enough, I went along to his drinks last night and I asked Nick about what his thoughts were on host-read advertising.
I'm in a very noisy pub with Nick Hilton. Nick, where are we and what are we doing here?
We're at a pub in Farringdon, London, where I'm hosting a podcast networking drinks tonight. You were kind enough to come along.
Yes.
And I promised you I would be early so we could do this, and I was not early, and therefore the ambience reflects the fact that people have now arrived. So
okay.
I apologise.
Now, I wanted to interview you because you wrote a post on Medium which is called "Let's Change the Standards for Host-Read Podcast Advertising." Give us a synopsis of what you wrote.
Yeah, so it came to me in the sense that I'm always just coming up with ideas of things to write and sort of talk about. But I was listening to Pivot with Scott Galloway and Kara Swisher, and I was listening to Scott Galloway reading an advert for an electric car at the start. And I thought there's some sort of cognitive dissonance going on here, that this man who's like an uber successful entrepreneur, investor, a millionaire in his own right, reading these sort of crappy adverts for electric cars. I mean, maybe a really good electric car, and he also may be a shareholder in this electric car, but I don't know. The point is that there was something which was like a contrast here that didn't sit right with me, and it brought to mind previous thoughts I've had about this when I used to work with journalists, and like serious journalists who covered policy and social affairs and politics, and we would then produce the podcast, and they would be asked by Acast or whoever was selling the adverts to read adverts by HSBC, and it wasn't baked into their contract that they have to read these, and they weren't skimming, some of the profits, but they were lending their voice and by extension their credibility to a financial services product or something else. But it always felt to me a bit like, what's going on here? I mean, no other form of media sort of accepts this as just a given in terms of how you fund your product. So that was the starting point for the blog, which comes to no particular conclusion other than maybe hosts need to be a bit more upfront in saying, if I'm going to lend my voice to this advert, I want 30% of all advertising revenue from that advert. Or maybe it has to be that we as the industry have to be like, we need to draw a clearer line between editorial content and advertising, which is a reasonable thing.
Especially if that's a dynamic ad insertion and they can put it against every previous podcast as well.
Yeah.
So they can take the current host read and literally go back against every podcast. So, but why don't you think people are aware of, their value, and why aren't they aware of charging more for host-read ads?
Well, we've come to this kind of accepted standard in the industry that host-read advertising is where the money is where if you're making content, it's the holy grail. You've reached the point where, Acast or Audio Boom or whoever's selling your adverts will say, we've got this client who wants you to read it out. And that's seen as a really good thing, rather than being like, I should be a little bit concerned for our editorial independence, for the kind of the tone of the product, that making you all think about actually what the value of that is. So we've just sort of accepted it, and I think in a way that's relatively unquestioning, because it is the way that you can fund podcasts. But I think it's typical of a very immature media. And I compared it in the piece to InfoWars, actually. It's the thing it reminds me of, when InfoWars, Alex Jones would spit bile and say Satan was, impregnating America. And then he would be like, and also I've got these vitamin supplements and you should, buy them. And it's like telesales merged with news. Serious journalists to be sort of QVC salesmen every 15 minutes. And I just think it's just a weird dynamic. And as I say, typical of something which is immature rather than something which is reached maturity.
Yeah, I think it is out of desperation because everyone wants to fund their podcast somehow. And I think the analogy that you gave me that was very interesting is you picked some celebrities like George Clooney with Nero Coffee. And, he's forever known, associated that. But also,
we call it Nero Coffee. It's Nespresso. He's not associated with it at all. You put the name up.
Thank God for that. But the thing about it is, did you see recently all of those celebrities who have now been done for the failure of Sam Bankman-Fried, with the FTX, where they were endorsing it in the Super Bowl, and now they're being, taken as court on the back of their endorsing it. So again, should people, when they do host-read ads, think very carefully about where the ad's coming from and its longevity?
Look, I don't work in ad tech, so look, most of the advertising providers I work with give you the opportunity to exclude products that have, I don't think George Clooney is going to get sued for if I swallow an espresso capsule. But when you're dealing with crypto or you're dealing with gambling products, I think we'll see the Kardashians get stung by weight loss lollies and stuff like that. So, there are dangerous products, and I really hope that any serious journalistic endeavor filters for those things. I don't think it matters that much whether it's a really sus-looking crypto product or whether it's a major commercial high street bank. At the end of the day, if your voice is being used to create effectively a voiceover advert for a product, a major product, you should be remunerated in line with that and not have it treated as though, because it's an audio medium, it's inherently your own voice which has to be used.
Yeah, the other thing you said to me the other day was, funny enough, if you wanted Scott Galloway to do the voiceover on your own podcast, not his, he would charge you an absolute fortune.
Right. Yeah, and I presume that all of these things are tied into the contract, that the manufacturer of this electric car can't rip that advert out and Scott Galloway's voiceover and put it on a TV advert. I assume that's all written in the contract. But either way, you go to Scott Galloway's agent and say, I want him to record a voiceover for this electric car ad. He's charging a lot of money. And that's Scott Galloway. Sort of like Scott Galloway is a mainstream celebrity and he has a born celebrity. But there are so many people whose voices are mine. The cheapest way to get a voiceover from Jason Bateman probably is to get an ad read on Smartless. It probably costs less than it would cost if you were going to get him to do one for TV. I'm not there yet in terms of where we're aligning with products. And I just think for this idea that this is the route to profitability, was to integrate more and more adverts, smush them into the editorial content, create this sort of mush that is indecipherable. It's native advertising, which was in fashion, goes out of fashion, but print native advertising is always... you never had the idea that Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists would write copy. In fact, it was always totally distinct. The New York Times had a very strict line. They said, if you write native advertising copy, you will never write in the New York Times paper, because they wanted to keep those things totally separate.
We used to call them Chinese walls.
Right. And what we're essentially asking is for top journalists to also be presenting the copy to adverts, and that's I don't know.
And I guess what we're playing on is the audience's trust with the host to sell the product.
100%. It's not, when it comes to those products that are being sold, it's not the podcast that is really selling those products. Otherwise, they would just sit programmatic advertising it. The fact that there is such excess value, there is such a premium on host-raised podcast advertising, shows that it is the voice of the host that matters. It is that trust, it is that reputation that the host has. And I would very rarely sit down and be like champion for host to ask for more money. Not my blood, but they should, because they are the product there.
Well, it comes to no surprise to me, because we talked about it the other day, that I wouldn't rather have advertising anyway within podcasting and use the value for value model with micropayments. Well, I think you're slightly sceptical on that model still.
Not at all. Look, I fear it may be too late, but I would have much rather with being long-term and asking people to pay for their podcasts and not, bet ourselves to the will of the advertising industry and, by extension, indentured ourselves to the market forces and the winds of the global economic downturn that's coming for us. So look, I would much rather we had always built in that. And your experience will inform people much more than, I think, something like Luminary, which is just always a bad idea. But, so I think it might be too late. But look, I wish it had been done differently. And I hope that, I personally think their podcast will probably iterate towards something a little bit more dynamic in the coming years, something maybe more hybrid audio, video, perhaps with more emphasis on live audio. And I do hope that we, from the off, start baking in ways of paying for it, rather than trying to do it 20 years down the line. This is the VC model, to be like, let's salt the earth, let's get a huge user base, and we'll worry about profitability down the line. And it has, I swear on this podcast, it's got the internet, because so much of the internet was predicated on this advertising model that relied on IRL products to sustain what had become a much bigger part of society. We relied on, high street products to sustain in the internet, which was just always a crap idea. And I just hope that, as you're doing with Podbads, and as lots of people are now realizing we have to do, we bake in the idea that you pay for it upfront to save us the trauma of dealing with advertisers.
Nick Hilton talking in a very noisy pub with Sam. In case you're wondering, we cleaned that audio up with Adobe Podcast. Here's what the original sounded like.
And I'll be on later to talk about the value of podcast post-read advertising.
And here's what Adobe Podcast did to it.
And I'll be on later to talk about the value of podcast post-read advertising.
So there's a thing.
Last week, James, we had an interview with Amy Tucker from the Podcast Academy, lovely lady that she is. It seems that the press release about who does what at the Podcast Academy came out this week. So who does what, James?
Yes, we got the news first, I think. So it's the association's 2023 to 24 officers. Two people continuing. Donald Albright is continuing as the chairperson, and it's good to have some consistency there. He, of course, runs Tenderfoot TV. Christy Mirabal from SiriusXM is continuing as vice chairperson, which is also good. But there's a new secretary, Martha C. Little from Audible. So good to see Audible as part of the organisation. She's replacing Alia Tavakolian, and the new treasurer is Sierra Reid from Vision Media Partners. That used to be Rob Greenlee's gig. So good to see some additional names on that list as well.
Indeed. And now let's hope they do something more that hits our radar other than just the ambies.
Yeah, indeed. I would certainly agree with that. I think, yes, the Podcast Academy needs to up its game a little bit in terms of stuff, as do the Podcast Standards Project and various other people. I think that more news is required from those types of people. But it's good news that we've heard who is doing what though.
Now let's have a whiz around the world. Over here in the UK, the winners of the Publisher Podcast Awards were announced this week. And Podcast of the Year went to Hot Money from the Financial Times, which I have to say was a very, very good podcast. But it seems so long ago, under just my memory, because I listened to it when it first came out. So that was back last year, mid last year. Anyway, it won the Podcaster of the Year. The FT did really well. It won 3 awards. Best investigative podcast, as we said, for Hot Money, a series turning the spotlight on the porn industry. And you can be safe listening to that podcast. I can tell you now, there's no smuttiness in it. So you're okay. You won't be shocked. You can listen to it if you want.
Yes, well, that also won Publisher Podcast of the Year, and the FT also, as you say, won Best Family and Lifestyle Podcast for Money Clinic with Claire Barrett. And in the UK, the Arias, which are have always historically been the radio awards, they had their Best New Podcast categories supported by Audible, all kinds of names in there.
Yeah, but one that stands out for us is Crowd Network, which won the silver for Go Love Yourself. So congratulations to Michael Carr and the team at Crowd Network.
Yes, which is a wonderful thing. It's an interesting sort of mix, the nominations and the gold, silver, bronze for that category. Lots of radio folk, talk sport, BBC News, and all of that, and a fair amount of non-radio stuff in there. History Hit has been doing some interesting stuff along with 1860 and Jack Boswell and various other people. I think History Hit have done an awful lot of stuff around the coronation. Which is this weekend, isn't it? You get a new king this weekend, don't you?
Oh, don't, please. No. I'll be painting my nails or doing something more useful.
You'll be standing to attention, I hope, and taking the affirmation.
I've done that before
for Prince Charles.
Yeah, I did it to the Queen. I'm not doing it to the King. I've done my bit. Thanks. No.
Well,
no.
let's.
Anyway,
yes.
you in your republic to be soon. So don't you come up with me and the royals, all right? So the Australians are going to vote. They've deferred the vote for a year just to be nice, but they're going to vote him out.
Well, I would probably agree with that. Yes, you're probably absolutely correct. They're not actually going to be putting Charlie onto our banknotes.
Surprise.
So the Queen is on our $5 banknotes, yes, at the moment, and the Queen will continue there for a couple of years because she lives forever, Sam.
Oh, look at you.
In our hearts. But what you will notice is that will be replaced by somebody who is Indigenous or Torres Strait Islander. We don't know yet who that person is going to be. But that's a good thing. Let's move on to other places as well that the UK has lost interest in and given up. Zambia, which the UK used to own until 1953. A podcast is on tour there. Really interesting. It's a podcast called Africana Woman. It's touring 3 cities, although 2 have already sold out in Zambia anyway. So you won't be going to the ones in Kabwe or Lusaka. But Kitwe, though, you can still go to that one. Chudu Chansa is the person who is running that tour. And it's all about supporting the growth and development of ambitious, high-performing women. It's the first time I think I've ever seen a podcast on tour in an African country. So that's pretty good. And interestingly, they're live shows, but they're not getting recorded, so that women can actually say what they really feel, and they won't end up regretting anything when it gets turned into a podcast. So good for Chulu, I think.
Yeah, amazing. Now, over to Asia, the podcast network builder has been launched by Pod Machine and Podcast Network Asia. The tool is designed to help brands and companies build their own podcast networks. I didn't quite understand why you'd want to do that, but tell me more, James.
Yeah, so this is a podcast company that is very keen to... they've run a large podcast network for themselves. They understand how difficult and complicated it is to run a podcast network. And so this company will not only help you make the shows, but they will also deal with all of the network stuff as well. If you you want to change an ad in 30 different shows, then it can be a bit of a nightmare. But Podcast Network Builder is new and will actually help with that. I find it a fascinating company. The Podcast Network Asia set of folk, they're doing some really interesting things, and some of those will stick and some of those will go away. But Pod Machine, for example, which is basically you pay an amount of money every single month and they will make your shows for you. So I could just give them our recording of me and you and say, take out the fluffs and the and the edit points and and edit it for us, please.
There'd be nothing left.
There'd be nothing left. You're absolutely right.
People news on the Pod News Weekly Review.
SCA, which is the biggest radio broadcaster in Australia and owner of the Listener app, has announced a new CEO, John Kelly, who's the company's current COO. The current CEO, Grant Blackley, will step down at the end of June. He's had a good 6-year run. Also, Jane Elliott, who used to work for Nova Entertainment as their communications person, has joined a company called Sound Story, which is a branded podcast company and many other things as a communications director as well. Elsewhere in Canada, there is a new editor-in-chief of Canadaland, who I want to call Karin Pugliese. Doubtless that's not the way that she pronounces her name because she's Canadian and not Italian. But Karin is the new editor-in-chief of that podcast network. And Jim Lally has been appointed as EVP of Strategic Partnerships at Audio Boom. He'd been at Soundrise and Market Ingenuity. Elsewhere, a friend of the show, Kathy Doyle, has been appointed to the Strategic Advisory Board of Mission Based Media, which is a podcast company. She was, of course, at Macmillan Publishers as well. Those are all of the bits of good news. There's plenty of bad news, though, it has to be said this week, in terms of layoffs. An awful lot of layoffs at Vice Media and Vice News. All of the people on the Vice audio team have been laid off. All of the APAC newsroom, all of the Waypoint gaming site that Vice used to own. And we hear that Vice Media is apparently headed for bankruptcy. Not sure whether or not that's going to eventuate, but that's going on. Also, Disney companies have been making lots of layoffs, both at ESPN, where the VP of ESPN Audio, Scott McCarthy, is just one of those people, and at National Geographic, which I learn is majority owned by Disney. They own 70% of the shares. Ellie Chen and Jacob Pinter and the team who ran their Overheard podcast have been laid off as well. So, yes, there are plenty of good news, but also plenty of bits of bad news as well in the industry. And let's hope that you're not affected as well. Not you, Sam, but you, the listener.
Thanks.
If you see what I mean.
Thanks for caring, James.
Anyway, if you've got positions that you would like to promote, then we would love that. Podnews.net/jobs is where you can post those for free, just like Spotify have. Spotify has a job going for Spotify podcast client partner for Europe, Middle East and Africa. And that's, you'd be based in London, in England. Poor you. But anyway, you'll find details of that and everything else at podnews.net/jobs.
Yes, and last but not least, Rob Greenlee is starting a new gig or a new podcast. He's got a new show called Trust Factor, which is on a network called the 100 TV Network, which I haven't heard about, but it starts at 11 a.m. It's a half-hour show, and it's also available on YouTube. So congratulations to Rob Greenlee.
Trust Factor with Rob Greenlee focuses on all aspects to building human trust in online communications. Only on 100 TV.
The tech stuff on the Pod News Weekly Review.
Yes, it's the stuff you'll find every Monday in the Pod News newsletter. Here's where we do the Tech Talk. Podcast Guru is now supporting Podping, Sam.
Yeah, well, congratulations to them. It's another one to the fold. I'm glad to see that most of us now who are apps are supporting it. It does make it easier for listeners to get their podcast episodes quicker. So come on, Apple and Spotify. What are you waiting for? When are you going to start to support Podping? does the answer never come to mind? But we also, I keep asking, maybe I'll have to do it myself, but is there going to be a way of getting a host comparison chart to show what tags and what features that hosts support? That would be lovely. And we could then see what's missing. Is that the wall of shame or the wall of fame? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that would certainly be something that we should be working on. And I mean, maybe Airtable or something like that would be the right choice for that, and invite a bunch of people to come on and edit that. Perhaps that might be an interesting thing to do.
Now, hosting companies. Talking of hosting companies, Libsyn won a Stevie Award. When I first read that, I thought it was a Stevie Wonder Award, but that's wrong.
But no,
it is a Stevie Award, and I have no idea what that is, James. So I'll ask you, what is a Stevie Wonder Award or a Stevie Award?
I've got no idea what a Stevie Award is, but there are plenty of exciting things going on there. It's a set of awards for there were 3,700 nominations, so worthwhile mentioning that. So congratulations for Libsyn for actually winning an award in it. It's the American Business Awards. And it's been going for 21 years, but it's American, which is why you've not heard of it. So many congratulations to Pittsburgh's Libsyn. Also, Buzzsprout has added a new feature. You can now add unlimited team members to your podcast. So if you've got lots of different people who are working on your podcast with you, then you no longer need to share usernames and passwords. You can give everybody their own usernames and passwords, and that's a good thing. Well done, Buzzsprout. That's an excellent plan. There's a new space for announcements where changes have been made to the podcast namespace, which Dave Jones has added. We'll link to that in the show notes as well. And some interesting stuff going on with Pocket Casts, Sam.
Yeah, Pocket Casts have clarified their pricing changes. So they're saying that the price hike, which we talked about last week, is for new subscribers only. So if you're grandfathered in, I guess you're not going to get a price change.
Yeah, which is nice. So if you're already subscribed and you're paying $14.99 a year, which went up in January, then you're not going to have to pay $40. It'll still just be $14.99. So that's not a bad plan. But they've also released episode search within their app, which is a very good thing and a good addition. So you can search for people's names and stuff and find out all of the shows that they have been mentioned on in terms of the episode search. And there's a long, tedious blog post all about how they managed to achieve that and what database structure that they needed to change in order to achieve that. But if you would like to read it, then be my guest. You'll find
I will.
Show notes as well. Yes, you'll be reading it because
yes,
that would be ideal. That would be ideal for you. Mark Cuban, the man. No, go on.
I said it was on the roadmap, so now I'll go and find out how to do it now instead. Now,
yes,
much better.
Well, yeah, you might as well. Mark Cuban, the man with the big teeth, he has confirmed $25 million in funding for Fireside, not Dan Benjamin's Fireside, but Mark Cuban's Fireside. Fireside these days is all about streaming video, and if you look at their paid for, very clearly paid for journalist stories, then almost all of them say incorrectly compared with companies like Clubhouse. Well, I mean, given that they were directly comparing themselves with companies like Clubhouse when they launched, that's a bit strong, but still, there we are. That said, Fireside does have $25 million in funding, whereas Clubhouse has just made more than half of its total staff redundant. So maybe they're not like Clubhouse at all. Ad Ores has also launched a new podcast hosting company, or a new podcast hosting solution, I should say, on Casterpod.com. Now, if you remember, Casterpod.org is where you can get the open source Casterpod code, and you can host your own on your own server, and that's all lovely. But surprise, surprise, there are some people that don't want to do that. And so if you don't want to do that, but you want to use Casterpod, which is an excellent podcasting 2.0 ready tool, then you can just sign up and pay a monthly fee at casterpod.com, which is very clever.
Well done, Benjamin. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the new podcast standards project, and we talked about who was involved and what was happening. And one of the companies that stood out was Acast, after my interview with Lizzie Pollitt. And I said to Lizzie, could you get one of your people to come on and tell us about what you're doing with the podcast standards project? So she kindly got Quamme Rhoden, who's their principal engineer, to come on and tell us what they're doing with the podcast standards project.
For a little bit of background on the way that Acast looks at the podcast standards project, it's really a group of several organizations coming together and aligning on a variety of standards to implement as a group. There's a classical chicken and egg problem anytime that you've got open standards, especially when we have two distinct sides of things with publishers and consumers of that standard, where you really want to make sure that the consumers are ready to consume the new standard, and the consumers really want to make sure that the publishers are ready to publish the new standard. And so the Podcast Standards Project is really just kind of a building of a consortium, building of a group of people that, because there are more of us, it's a little bit easier to move the needle in terms of adoption. And Acast is just one of the people that have signed on to participate and implement some of those standards and sort of align on which of those standards make the most sense to implement in what order as a group.
And I think that's correct. So with Acast's hat and your role in mind, what, if any, so far of the standards have you implemented at Acast?
Sure. So we've implemented and deployed support for the podcast locked tag on ingest. So we won't import feeds that have that locked tag in place. And then we've also got implemented but not deployed support for a couple of other tags. Obviously, the podcast namespace, and we've got a bit of a process to go through to get everything out and live. We've also got the funding tag implemented for our customers that are using Acast Plus. And then there are a couple of others that are on the roadmap. Transcripts are coming soon. There's some special challenges at Acast because of our use of dynamic audio and the way that we implement dynamic audio that make it difficult for us to do time-stamped information appearing in the feed. But we are coming up with what it is that we can do to support that. And there's definitely a few other things that are on our radar as well.
No, that's really cool. I mean, transcript being a big one, given how much you as Acast use transcripts for a lot of your conversational advertising and keyword targeting. The other ones, I guess, the easier ones to implement are things like the person tag. How do you, or who does, is it your role to determine what tags to add?
So, I mean, within Acast, we have a number of stakeholders that sort of determine roadmap. Definitely engineering plays a role in figuring out what makes sense to implement. Engineering's perspective is largely on level of effort, but also we can weigh in, but that's largely down to the product side of the organization.
Okay. So one of the other tags that I think most of the independent podcast platform players are excited about is value for value. And you said you support the funding tag. Do you think you would extend that out to the value tag as well?
I don't think that we've got any immediate plans that I would be able to talk about.
So beyond the podcast standards project, again, Acast are looking to be a member of the community. Will you bring new ideas into this project?
Yeah, so obviously Acast has a number of initiatives that we've tried in the past that may be interesting and valuable as a starting point. From my perspective, from watching, and I do watch the various Podcasting 2.0 efforts, especially and including the podcast namespace work, it's fast-moving and experimental, and it's not something that I think we're likely to benefit by asking people to slow down, and we're really excited to see that work developing. But I would personally like to be more involved. We've got a lot going on all the time. I think that the best thing that we can do as an organization is to implement the standards where they make sense and maybe help provide guidance on how to support the scale and the technology that Acast has, which is somewhat unusual in the space still. I mentioned the transcript tag being difficult to implement in RSS feeds. Another example is chapters, where we do support ID3v2 chapters with dynamic audio, but it would be impossible for us to implement that at the feed level because we don't have any idea at the time that the feed is generated where those timestamps are going to be.
Right.
So I think that input can come later from my perspective. I don't know if that answers your question, but we're excited. Like, we are absolutely watching and aware of the work that's going on. It's moving at a pace that I think is really exciting, and I don't want to slow it down.
No, it is very exciting. I think we're moving into phase 7. I can't believe we're already into phase 7. Now, outside of the podcast namespace, one of the other areas that everyone's talking about in 2023 is AI. And again, is this something that Acast is embracing?
Yeah, so as LP mentioned, there are certainly AI techniques being used in terms of the conversational targeting, and it is an area of future investment. I mean, AI is being used all over the place, where there are AI techniques being used to actually produce the transcripts. AI techniques are being used for converting those transcripts into meaning in order to support conversational targeting. And then we also are able to use AI in a variety of other ways to help us with better targeting for content. So it's an area of continued investment at Acast, and I think that there's some more exciting stuff to come on that front.
Cool. Chris, if anyone wants to find out more about what's going on with Acast, where would they go?
Yeah, check out acast.com, and there's a lot of new stuff coming out all the time. It's an exciting time for us.
Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam. It was great talking with you.
Chris Quamme Rhoden from Acast. If you are sitting with bated breath waiting for Oscar Merry from Fountain, he will be on next week, not this week. But good things happen to those who wait. There are some awards coming up, aren't there, Sam?
Yeah, the 18th Annual People's Choice Podcast Award is now open for registration until the end of July. The registration fee is unchanged from last year. I don't know what that was last year, so I better check. And anyone can enter wherever you are. So it sounds like an international podcast award.
Yes, which is a good thing. I think the registration fee is only $50, so I don't think it's a massive thing. This is the one that Todd Cochran runs.
Don't leave me, Todd Cochran.
You've actually got until the end of July if you want to enter that. And it's well worth doing. Podnews is a media partner, and well worth entering that. And then there are People's Choice votes, where the people go to do the voting and all kinds of stuff. So all of that is going on, which is nice. In terms of events for people to go to, there's a Podcaster Drinks on May the 9th in Melbourne, in Victoria. Am I going to it? No, it's in Melbourne.
I don't know.
So
I can tell you the geography of Australia.
Yes. No, it's a 3-hour flight away. So okay. I doubt that that's going to happen. But really good to see that coming back again. There was a Melbourne Podcasters Meetup, which I did go to once, which was great fun to go to. But that has been relatively quiet for the last couple of years. And Adam Jaffrey, who was one of the originals who planned that, has now brought this idea of just getting together in a pub, which sounds like a good plan. So if you're in Melbourne, then firstly, my commiserations, but secondly, May the 9th is the day, and it's at the Arbory Bar in number 1 Flinders Walk, wherever that is. So well worth going to. Also, pod pitching at City University is happening as well on May the 9th, where you can watch City journalism students pitching their projects to top industry commissioners from places like the BBC and Listen and Rethink Audio and History Hit. So that's a good thing. You're going to that, aren't you?
I am indeed. I'm looking forward to that, and hoping to interview Darby Doris as well from This Is Listen. So yes, that'll be cool.
Which would be good. The next time I leave the house will be, not quite literally, the next time I leave the house will be in about an hour's time. I'm off to watch Dylan Moran to doing some stand-up. But the next time I leave the house to fly somewhere will be in a couple of weeks, going to the New Zealand Podcasting Summit, which is in Auckland on the 13th of May. Tickets are still available to that. If you would like to take part, then you should be. You can find out more information at podnews.net/events. There is also, of course, the podcast show in London, which is happening towards the end of May. If you want to use the promo code PodNews, then you can save money on pretty well everything that's available there, including the preview night lineup, which is also happening. One thing that they did do is that they announced an international industry advisory panel, which I thought was a really clever idea. So basically, they've got a large set of international folk who they can use to basically make sure that the podcast show 2023 is a great show for international people as well, which I thought was a really clever plan. So many congratulations to them. Hopefully this time next week we'll have somebody on from the podcast show 2023 to tell us more about who is speaking. But I can tell you that I will be speaking. They've given me a much larger room this year. I know, a much larger room, 400 people. So I really want that filled, because otherwise it'll be really, really embarrassing. So I think I'm the first speaker on the first day, although it's not yet on the website. If you are going to the podcast show 2023, please come to my gig, because otherwise it'll look embarrassing. So that should be very good. And also I'm in Toronto at the beginning of June for Radio Days North America, and Podcast Movement in Denver in the middle of August as well. So many events happening. And of course, there's ours too. Podnews Live in Salford in Greater Manchester is on the 13th of June. Tickets are on sale for that. Podnews.net/live. We would love to see you there. We will have a full list of our speakers and what they'll be talking about and everything else in the next few days at podnews.net/live. We'd love to see you if you are in the north of England, or maybe even if you're not in the north of England, do come along and see us. Podnews.net/live is where to get tickets.
Now, further afield, September is the British Podcast Awards, and they've announced that the host of How to Fail, Elizabeth Day, has been announced as the chair of the judges. There is a massive roster of judges. I'd just like to point out, over 40 it felt like. I didn't actually count. And I still didn't make the cut, James. No one knows me. No one asks. No one ever cares. I've got to change my agent. Well, let's think. I don't have an agent. Maybe that's the problem.
Maybe that's it.
Yes.
Maybe that's it. But
what's your agent like? It sounds like he does a good job, or she does a good job.
Yeah, I don't have one either. So
there you go.
There's a thing. But yes, I have to say, I am asked quite often, will you be a judge in these awards? And I turn around and I say no, because I literally don't have the time, and I would much rather do a good job or not do a job at all. So I will normally point people towards other people that I know will do a good job. But the British Podcast Awards are one of the good ones. You've until the 18th of May to enter. We could enter this very show, couldn't we?
We could, apart from the fact that who owns the British Podcast Awards and we'll never win.
Oh, yes, there is always that. Yes, it's run by PodPod, which is apparently a podcast newsletter. So anyway, there are more events, both paid for and free, at Podnews. If you're organising something, then you can tell the world about it too. It's free to be listed, podnews.net/events.
Podnews Live, where the podcast industry connects. Get your tickets now at podnews.net/live. Boostergram Corner on the Podnews Weekly Review.
Oh, it's my favourite time of the week. Yes, we've got lots more boostergrams, Sam, which is very excellent.
Yeah, Nathan Garthright. Have I got that right? Have I got that wrong? Gathright. Look, I'll just get him on the show once and he could put me right. Thanks for adding update frequency to the Podnews RSS feed. I hope it proves a nice progressive enhancement that doesn't require all hosts to get on board before apps make it available to listeners. So did you add it, James?
Yes, I added the update frequency to the Podnews RSS feed. It was very easy, and the clever thing that Nathan had done is that he had already written an example for what a daily podcast that's updated on a weekday would look like. So it was just a case of copy and paste.
There you go.
So if you host yourself, then you can put anything you like in the RSS feed. So that's what I did. But no, I would agree with that. So I think that that's a good thing. And I think also the Podroll tag is also a good thing. And Dave Jones has quite rightly pointed out that we kept on saying Podfollow last week.
Did we? Oh.
And we didn't mean that. We meant Podroll. Podroll. That's the one that we meant, and it's very good. Thank you for 5,150 sats. Is that a special?
It is.
Is that a special?
It is.
What was that then?
It's a Van Halen tribute, isn't it, or something?
Thank you, Dave. That's very kind.
Nick said, Fountain is waiting for you, Joe Rogan. He sent us 2121 sats. Yeah, Fountain, if you can get Joe Rogan on there, well done, mate. That will be a massive boost.
Yes, that looks like Nick Malster from Fountain. Yes, if Joe Rogan, I mean, wouldn't that be amazing if Joe Rogan stopped going with Spotify and ended up moving to value for value? I mean, he knows Adam Curry. So who knows? It might be a plan. Yeah, that would be an amazing thing. Somebody called I Love Sushi says, excited to hear Oscar Mary will be on with you next time. And we really mean next time this time. Sending a boost as a test from the newest Fountain Beta. Fountain Beta, 1,000 sats. Thank you. I Love Sushi. And Kyrin from the Mere Mortals podcast with all these weird names you're trying to pronounce. It's time you started picking up a second language. And then asks whether a Spanish version will be coming soon. No, there is already a Spanish version of a podcast newsletter that you can get. It's called Notipod Hoy, except it's probably not pronounced that way. And it's put together by a nice man called Melvin, who's very nice and does an excellent job. So go and read that if you want to read your podcast news in Spanish. But don't stop, obviously, reading Podnews or the Podcast Business Journal, because that would be bad. If you get value from what we do, the Podnews Weekly Review is separate from Podnews, and Sam and I share everything from it. We really appreciate your support so we can continue making this show, genuinely. You can become a power supporter if you like, weekly.podnews.net. If you have a credit card, jump in there, or you can use the Apple Podcast subscription, apple.co/podnews. You can support us with sats by hitting the boost button in your podcast app too. And if you don't have a new podcast app with a boost button, then you should probably get one. Podnews.net/new podcast apps will help you find a new app. I would recommend Fountain because it's quite good. And also, I'm an advisor. Now, what's happening for you this week, Sam?
It's been a busy week, but before I do dive into it, Naomi Mellor was due on the show a couple of weeks ago to talk about the Podcast Publishing Awards and also the International Women's Awards. I didn't know why she didn't show up, and sadly I do now. She was unfortunately in a car accident, so we wish her a speedy recovery, and hopefully we'll have her on the show when she recovers in a few weeks' time.
Yes.
So Naomi, get well.
Yes, exactly, and Naomi, get well. You've just been to Nick Hilton's. Well, as we record, you're going to go to Nick Hilton's Bad Podcasters Club in there, London, aren't you?
I am indeed. So that's in the middle of the city, and yes. That will be great. I also spoke.
Is he running one at the podcast show? Do you know?
No, he's not. He's not going to be there this year. He's flying
Rubbish.
away with his wife. So yes, he's
Rubbish. Off. Can you not cancel that honeymoon stroke
holiday?
Holiday.
Yeah. Well, he could, but I don't think he'll. I think he'll find the locks changed and the door locked. Yeah. So yes, had a good old chat with Jess from She Podcasts, Ariel and Lauren, who will be at the London Podcast Show. We're trying to squeeze them into the show. The nice people at the London Podcast Show are thinking about it, and if not, hopefully, if we do a Pod News live, this show basically, we'd love to have them on the stage with us. So we'll see. We'll certainly have Ariel and Lauren doing something with us at the show.
Well, that should be good. You've also been chatting about podcast TXT and webhooks with Tom Rossi from Buzzsprout. I noticed that he has put a new idea into the new podcast namespace GitHub, which is a good idea in terms of the UX, not too dissimilar to the good idea that I put forward a year or so ago. But still, and apparently you're testing it in PodFans, which is nice.
Yeah, and it works really simply. It works really well. So again, it's like the pod roll thing. You know, it was just simple, quick. We implemented it in a day, and it works. And the it's not called Podcast TXT. We're thinking of calling it Podcast Verify or Verification. Yeah. And it's a one-off. There's no tokens. So it's a really simple click, bang. It verifies. It comes back. Job done. No. Let me put my email back in. Let me then publish my RSS feed again. Let me wait for it to update.
Very nice.
Blah blah blah.
The UX is the important thing. So it's nice.
Indeed.
And you're on the Podcasting 2.0 show tonight.
Yeah, I am. Yes. Well, I say I am. Let me just clarify that. It depends if Adam's teeth are in or not. Yes, he's had a very painful period where he's had some surgery, so there wasn't a show last week. I am due on tonight, but if it doesn't go out, maybe I'll be on another week. But if I am, it'll be tonight. Yes.
No, indeed.
James, now come on, that's my busy week. What's happened for you?
I've had a relatively busy week. I was on the Grow My Podcast Summit with all kinds of other excellent speakers. So that was fun. I'm on a bunch of different podcasts as well, none of which I can quite remember at this exact moment, but still, there you go. But yes, it's been an interestingly busy week. There's been a couple of things that I've enjoyed doing. One of them has been reviewing the Nemono sound capsule, which is a little sort of device, $2,500, little sort of device that you can record shows with. And I have to say that was a really impressive piece of kit, although $2,500 it kind of ought to be. But I also ended up reviewing the Sennheiser Profile mic, which is Sennheiser's first USB microphone for podcasters. And that is a great microphone as well. Really, really good. Quite cheap in terms of a microphone. I think from memory it's $129 US, but sounds fantastic, as you would expect from Sennheiser. They make a lot of really good pro audio gear. So it's quite interesting sort of playing around with tools and stuff that people are sending me to review. So that's been quite a nice thing. So I've rather enjoyed doing that. So yes, and the only other thing I've been doing is basically being grumpy in various radio industry publications about AM radio, which has been an entertainment. But that's I suppose that's my other hat.
There you go.
So there we are. Anyway, that's it for this week.
Thank you to our guests, Chris and Nick. And if you'd like to give us feedback using email, send it to weekly@podnews.net or send us a Boostagram, which we prefer. If your podcast app doesn't support Boost, then grab a new one from podnews.net/new podcast apps.
There's not long left to get your Podnews Live tickets. It's where podcasting connects in Manchester in June. You can get those at podnews.net/live, a whole day of great ideas and great networking. Our music is from Studio Dragonfly. Our voiceover is Sheila D. And we're hosted and sponsored by Buzzsprout. Podcast hosting made easy.
Get updated every day. Subscribe to our newsletter at podnews.net. Tell your friends and grow the show.
And support us.
The Podnews Weekly Review will return next week. Keep listening.